The border outpost was the kind of place no one wanted to be stationed at for long. A small wooden cabin, set deep in a valley with the closest town nearly 2 hours away. It was just me for the next 6 weeks, alone with the trees, the mountains, and the road that stretched into the wilderness. My job was simple: monitor the border, log any unusual activity, and report to headquarters every morning and evening. The cabin was old but functional. A single-room structure with a cot in one corner, a desk, a shortwave radio, and a wood-burning stove. Supplies came once a week. The road leading here was rough, often washed out during heavy rains. There was a shed behind the cabin where extra fuel, food, and basic tools were stored. The nearest official checkpoint was over 50 miles away, and aside from the occasional patrolling officer passing through, I was alone. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent my time checking the perimeter, making sure the road was clear, and logging the occasional vehicle that passed by. Most of them were just trucks carrying goods, local hunters, or travelers unaware they were this close to the border. A few looked suspicious, but as long as they didn't linger, I had no reason to intervene. Then, on the 5th night, I noticed something strange. It was nearly midnight when I heard the first noise. Something moving just outside the cabin. Not an animal. I knew the sounds of the forest well enough. This was deliberate, slow, careful. I reached for my rifle and quietly approached the window. The dim porch light barely illuminated the outside, but I caught a glimpse of movement near the tree line. Someone was there. I stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, and scanned the area. Nothing, just the wind stirring the trees. I waited, listening. After a few minutes, I went back inside, locking the door behind me. Maybe it was a poacher or a smuggler testing if the cabin was occupied. Either way, I stayed awake for the rest of the night, waiting. Nothing else happened. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt near the back of the cabin. Fresh ones. They led from the tree line to the shed and then back into the forest. I checked the shed, but nothing was missing. Still, someone had been here watching. The following night, I kept the lights off and waited. Around the same time as before, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, I moved to the window as quietly as possible, staying in the shadows. There was a figure standing just at the edge of the trees, barely visible. They were tall, wearing dark clothing. They stood there for nearly a minute, unmoving, before retreating back into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. The days passed, and I kept finding small signs that someone had been around. Footprints in the dirt, scratches on the wooden walls of the cabin, a small pile of rocks near the porch that hadn't been there before. Whoever it was, they wanted me to know they were watching. One morning, I woke up to find the radio in my cabin dead. It had been working fine the night before, and I had checked the connections. It wasn't just static, it was completely silent. I tried the backup in the shed. Same thing, no signal. The nearest town was too far for my handheld to reach. I was cut off. That night, I stayed up, rifle in hand. If they were going to come closer, I was going to be ready. The cabin was completely dark, and I sat near the window, watching the tree line. Around 2 in the morning, I saw movement. Not just one figure, two. They moved quickly, low to the ground, making their way toward the shed. My heart pounded as I raised my rifle, but I didn't move. I wanted to see what they were doing. One of them tried the door, locked. The other circled around the side, disappearing from view. Seconds later, I heard the sound of wood splintering. They were trying to break in. I stepped onto the porch, aiming in their direction. "I'm armed," I called out. Silence. Then the sound of footsteps retreating. They disappeared into the trees before I could get a good look at them. I waited, my pulse racing, but they didn't return. By morning, the shed door was damaged but still holding. I checked inside, nothing was missing. I spent the day securing everything, reinforcing the doors and windows. I didn't know what they wanted, but they weren't stopping. That night, I heard something new. A whisper, faint, coming from just outside the cabin. My name. My stomach turned to ice. I gripped the rifle and stayed in the darkness. Whoever it was, they knew who I was. I barely breathed as I listened. The whisper came again, this time from the back of the cabin. Then a soft tapping on the wall. I didn't move. I didn't respond. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Then silence. Minutes passed. An hour. Nothing. When the sun rose, I checked outside. No footprints. No sign that anyone had been there. But I knew what I had heard. For the next 3 days, I barely slept. The whispering didn't return, but I kept seeing figures in the trees. Always watching, never approaching. I was running low on supplies, and the next scheduled drop-off was still 4 days away. The radio was still dead. Then, on the 9th night, everything changed. I woke up to the sound of my door creaking open. I had locked it. I was sure of it. My heart slammed in my chest as I reached for my rifle. The cabin was pitch black. I stayed perfectly still, listening. A footstep. Inside. I didn't think. I fired a shot toward the sound. The muzzle flash lit up the room for a split second. There was no one there. I scrambled for my flashlight, shining it around. The door was open, swaying slightly. Outside, in the darkness, I saw them, at least 4 figures standing just beyond the porch, watching. I slammed the door shut, barricading it with the desk. My hands were shaking. They weren't just watching anymore. They were coming inside. I stayed awake until dawn, gun in hand. The figures didn't return, but I knew they were still out there. By noon, I packed my bag, grabbed every weapon I had, and left. I didn't care about protocol. I didn't care about the job. I walked down that broken road until I saw the supply truck in the distance. I waved them down. The driver took one look at me and didn't ask any questions. He just let me in and drove. I never went back to that cabin. I never asked what happened to the next guy who took my place. And I never, ever want to be that alone again. I never wanted the cabin. It was my uncle's before it became mine. He was one of those men who lived in the woods half the time, alone, doing whatever old men do when they don't want to be around people. He wasn't exactly a hermit, but close. He had a job in town, worked for a logging company, but every weekend he'd drive up to that cabin, and some weekends he wouldn't come back. I only went there once as a kid. My dad brought me up one summer when I was 10. It wasn't a fun trip. No TV, no neighbors, just trees and silence. The cabin smelled like old wood, damp clothes, and something sour in the corners. I remember asking my dad why Uncle Martin lived there. "Some people like to be alone," was all he said. Years later, Uncle Martin died. He fell off a ladder while clearing some tree branches behind the cabin. I wasn't close to him, so it didn't hit me hard, but the will was a surprise. He left the cabin to me. I didn't want it. I worked a construction job, lived in a small apartment, and had no interest in a rotting wooden house in the middle of nowhere. Selling it seemed like the best option, but I couldn't afford to leave work for long, and the place needed repairs before anyone would buy it. I decided to take a weekend and drive up there, fix a few things, clean up, and make a plan to get rid of it. Just 2 days, I told myself. I packed my truck with basic tools, some food, and a sleeping bag, figuring the old bed would be useless. The drive was long. The deeper I went into the woods, the worse the roads got. By the time I turned onto the dirt path leading to the cabin, the sun was already sinking. The trees stretched high on both sides, swallowing the road in shadow. The cabin looked the same as I remembered. Small, dark wood, set back from the road. The front porch sagged a little, and the windows were covered in grime. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment. It was dead silent. No cars, no voices, just wind in the trees and the ticking of my cooling engine. I grabbed my bag, went up the steps, and unlocked the door. Inside, it smelled just like I remembered. Dust and damp wood. The place was a mess. Old clothes, empty cans, a thick layer of dust on everything. I left my bag on the table and opened a few windows to air it out. I planned to sleep early, but I wanted to check the back of the cabin first, where Uncle Martin had his accident. The yard was overgrown, the trees pressing in close. The ladder was still there, tipped over in the grass. The broken branch was easy to spot, hanging like a snapped bone from the trunk. I stared at it for a while. The ground beneath was hard-packed dirt. No rocks, nothing sharp. A bad fall could kill a man, sure, but something about it felt off. I shook it off and went back inside. I ate a sandwich, checked my phone, no signal, and rolled out my sleeping bag on the couch. The air was cold, but I was too tired to care. The silence pressed in as I lay there. No traffic, no voices, just trees shifting in the wind. Then I heard something outside, a rustling, not the wind, something moving through the brush. I sat up, listening hard. It was slow, steady, something big, a deer maybe, or a bear. I reached for my flashlight and stood up, moving to the window. I couldn't see much, just the dark shapes of trees. Then it stopped, dead silence. I stood there for what felt like forever, my hand tight on the flashlight. Then, just as I was about to turn away, something moved near the tree line, a shape too tall for an animal. It was standing there, just beyond the reach of the light. I could feel it watching me. I stepped back from the window, my pulse hammering. Maybe it was a trick of the light, my tired brain playing games with me. I shut the window, locked the door, and grabbed my hunting knife from my bag. The sound didn't come back. I sat on the couch, knife in my lap, and waited. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I don't remember falling asleep. When I woke up, the sun was creeping through the windows. Everything seemed normal. No footprints, no broken windows. Maybe it was just an animal. I spent the day working, cleaning, fixing loose boards, clearing out junk. I wanted to finish fast, but the hours dragged. By evening, I was exhausted. Then I saw them, footprints, in the dirt behind the cabin, near the ladder. Not boot prints, bare feet. They came from the woods, stopped near the ladder, then turned back. My stomach dropped. Someone had been here. I checked my truck. Still locked. Nothing was missing. I wanted to leave, but it was getting dark, and driving those roads at night wasn't safe. I locked the doors, made sure my knife was close, and sat in the dark, waiting. The noise came back, not rustling, footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. My breath locked in my throat. I gripped the knife, my palms slick with sweat. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. A shadow passed by the window. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then the doorknob rattled. I nearly dropped the knife. I forced myself to stay still. The knob turned again. Slow, testing. Then silence. Long, awful silence. I stayed awake until dawn. When the sun finally rose, I packed my bag, grabbed my keys, and yanked open the door. The footprints were still there, leading from the woods, and back into them. I didn't look back. I didn't stop driving until I hit town. I put the cabin up for sale the same week. I never went back. Whoever was out there, whoever stood at my door in the dark, they could have it. I just hoped they didn't follow me home. It was late October, a cold, wet time of year in this part of France. I had taken some time off work and rented a cabin deep in the countryside, a few miles outside a small village near the Massif Central. It wasn't a touristy area, which is what I liked about it. The cabin sat alone on a patch of land surrounded by dense forests. A narrow gravel road, more of a track, led up to it, winding through the trees before ending at a small clearing. The only neighbor was an old, abandoned house about a half-mile away, barely visible through the thick branches. I wanted solitude. I told myself I needed it. Life had been relentless, and I craved the stillness of nature, the quiet hum of the forest, the simple routine of chopping wood, cooking basic meals, and sitting by the fire with a book. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, no television, just a radio with a weak signal which I barely used. The first couple of days were peaceful. I spent my time exploring the woods, taking long walks through damp trails covered in fallen leaves. I found an old hunting tower, long abandoned, its wooden beams covered in moss. I sat up there for a while, staring at the landscape, feeling small beneath the vast sky. At night, I cooked over the small stove and read by the dim light of a lantern. The wind howled against the cabin, and the rain came down in sheets, but inside, with the fire crackling, it felt safe. Then, on the third day, I noticed something strange. It was late afternoon, and I had been chopping wood behind the cabin when I felt it. That unmistakable feeling of being watched. I stopped, axe frozen in mid-swing, and looked up. The forest stood still, shadows stretching between the trees. Nothing moved, no branches rustled. The silence felt different, heavier. I told myself it was my imagination, just my mind playing tricks on me after spending too much time alone. But the feeling stayed with me. It followed me as I stacked the wood, as I went inside, as I made dinner. Even as I read by the fire that night, I found myself glancing at the window, expecting to see something move in the darkness. The next morning, I went for a walk, hoping fresh air would clear my head. The rain had let up, leaving the forest damp and misty. I followed a narrow path leading away from the cabin, deeper into the trees. After about a mile, I came across something I hadn't seen before. A small clearing with an old stone building, half collapsed. It looked like it had once been a barn or maybe a hunting lodge. The roof had caved in on one side, and vines crept over the walls. Something about it unsettled me. There were no signs of recent activity, no footprints, no disturbances in the dirt, but I had the overwhelming sense that someone had been there. I turned to leave when I noticed something on the ground. A cigarette, but half buried in the wet soil. Fresh. Someone had been here recently. I walked back to the cabin, moving faster than I had on the way in. The sense of unease grew stronger with each step. By the time I reached my clearing, I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if I had led something back with me. That night, I barely slept. The wind rattled the windows, and the trees groaned in the distance. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke suddenly to a sound outside. Footsteps. I froze, listening. Slow, deliberate steps moving through the wet grass. Then silence. I lay there, heart pounding, every muscle tense. I wanted to believe it was an animal, a deer maybe, but deep down I knew better. I waited, barely breathing. The only sound was the wind against the cabin. Then, just as I started to convince myself I had imagined it, I heard it again, closer this time. Someone was outside. I slipped out of bed, moving carefully so the wooden floor wouldn't creak. I reached for the axe I kept near the door. The cabin was small, just one main room with a little kitchen in the corner, and from where I stood, I could see both windows. I moved to the one facing the front, slowly pulling back the curtain. Nothing, just darkness. I checked the other window, and that's when I saw him. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the trees. He wasn't moving, just standing there watching the cabin. I gripped the axe tighter, my pulse hammering. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing, but I couldn't make out his face. He didn't carry a flashlight. He didn't call out. He just stood there. I don't know how long I watched him. Maybe a few seconds, maybe minutes, but finally he turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the chair near the door, axe in hand, listening. The footsteps never returned, but the forest felt different, heavier, like it was holding its breath. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I had enough supplies to last, but I wasn't going to spend another night out here. I packed quickly, throwing everything into my backpack, not caring if it was organized. But when I stepped outside, I stopped cold. Footprints, deep, clear imprints in the wet grass, leading from the woods to the window where I had stood last night. He had been closer than I thought. I locked up the cabin, though I knew it wouldn't stop anyone determined to get inside. I hiked back to my car, moving fast, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. I didn't see him again, but I felt him watching. When I reached the village, I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he was a hunter, someone passing through. Maybe it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I had stayed one more night, things would have ended differently. I never went back to that cabin, and I never found out who he was. I had never been one for isolation, but life had a way of pushing people into situations they never expected. The cabin belonged to my uncle, a man I hadn't spoken to in years, not since I was a teenager. He passed away a few months ago, and with no other direct family left, the property fell to me. It was deep in a valley, far from the nearest town, surrounded by thick forests and hills that swallowed any sound. A river ran somewhere nearby, though I couldn't see it from the porch. The place had been abandoned for years. When I arrived, it was clear no one had set foot here in a long time. The door had warped from weather, the roof sagged slightly in places, and dust coated everything inside. I had come to get the place ready to sell. That was the plan. Stay for a week, clean up, take some pictures, find a buyer, and be done with it. I figured a place like this would attract some hunter or retiree looking for peace and quiet. The first few days were uneventful. I worked during the day, clearing out old furniture, sweeping the floors, fixing up whatever I could. At night, I sat on the porch with a beer, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was a different kind of quiet out here, the kind that made you feel like you weren't alone. The wind through the trees almost sounded like whispers. The rustling in the brush just outside the porch light's reach always had me glancing up, expecting to see something standing there. There was nothing, of course, just the usual night creatures, raccoons, maybe a deer, but it unsettled me. On the fourth day, I decided to check out the shed behind the cabin. It was about 50 yards into the woods, half buried in brush and dead leaves. The padlock was rusted shut, but the wood around the latch was weak, so I pried it open with a crowbar. Inside, the air was thick with dust and old wood. Tools hung on the walls, covered in cobwebs. A workbench sat against the back wall, cluttered with rusted nails, screws, and cans of paint that had long since dried up. But there was something else, something that didn't belong. A sleeping bag, crumpled up in the corner. Empty food cans stacked neatly beside it. A pair of boots, worn and caked with dried mud. Someone had been living here. Recently, I backed out of the shed, scanning the trees. The thought of someone watching me, maybe right now, sent a cold wave through my chest. I locked the shed back up as best as I could and walked back to the cabin, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. I kept my gun on the nightstand, something I hadn't felt the need to do before. Sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the old wood, every gust of wind against the walls, had me wide awake, listening, waiting. Sometime after midnight, I heard something outside. It wasn't an animal, not the quick, darting sounds of a raccoon or the heavy steps of a deer. This was slow, deliberate, footsteps on the porch. My stomach tightened. I reached for the gun, my fingers stiff with adrenaline. The floorboards creaked. Someone was out there. I stayed still, barely breathing. Through the thin curtains, I saw a shadow shift across the porch. Someone was standing there, just outside the front door. I waited, listened. The footsteps moved again, this time towards the window. A shape passed by, just enough for me to see that it was a person. No flashlight, no talking, just standing there in the dark. Then, nothing. I don't know how long I lay there, gripping the gun. My heart beat so loud in my ears that I couldn't hear anything else. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Eventually, I forced myself to sit up, to move to the window. No one was there. The next morning, I searched the area, looking for tracks. The ground was too hard, too covered in dead leaves to see anything clear, but I knew what I had heard. Someone had been here. I packed my things. I wasn't going to spend another night in that cabin. I was loading my truck when I noticed something on the porch. The old welcome mat had been moved, pushed aside. Underneath, carved into the wood, were letters. "Don't stay." It wasn't fresh. The carving had been there for a while, but I hadn't noticed it before. How long had my uncle known? Had he been dealing with the same thing before he died? I didn't wait to find out. I got in the truck and drove, not stopping until I reached town. I booked a motel room for the night, barely slept, and by morning, I had called a realtor. I didn't care about fixing the place up anymore. I never went back. Months later, after the sale had gone through, I looked up old records on the property. My uncle had bought the land from a family in the early 90s. Before that, it had belonged to another man, a hermit who had disappeared sometime in the 70s. No one knew what happened to him. The new owner never reached out. I never asked. Whatever was out there, it wasn't my problem anymore. But I still wonder. When the wind is just right, when the night is too quiet, I remember the sound of those footsteps on the porch. And I wonder if the new owner has heard them too. I never planned on staying in the old cabin. It was supposed to be a quick stop, just long enough to check on the property and make sure everything was in order before I headed back to the city. My uncle had left it to me when he passed, an old wooden place sitting at the edge of a graveyard in a small town nobody really cared about. I hadn't been there in years. The cabin had been in my family for decades, but it had never really been a home. My uncle used it as a retreat, a place to get away from people. The graveyard behind it was old, mostly forgotten. There were headstones that leaned, names that had faded away with time. Some graves looked like they hadn't been visited in decades, maybe longer. I never understood why anyone would want to live so close to a place like that. But my uncle never seemed to mind. It was late afternoon when I arrived. The air smelled damp, like rain had passed through earlier. The trees around the cabin were tall, their branches twisted together like they were trying to block out the sky. The place looked exactly how I remembered it. Dark wood, a sagging porch, windows that seemed too small. The graveyard stretched out behind it, headstones barely visible through the trees. The door was stiff when I pushed it open, and the air inside smelled like dust and would rot. The furniture was still in place, a heavy wooden table, an old armchair in the corner, shelves filled with books that hadn't been touched in years. I set my bag down near the door and walked through the place, checking for leaks or any damage. The cabin was solid, but it felt abandoned in a way that made my skin itch. I had planned to leave before it got dark. The idea of staying overnight had never crossed my mind. But by the time I finished looking through everything, the sun was already low, and my truck wouldn't start. I checked the battery, the fuel, everything I could think of. Nothing. My phone had no signal, which didn't surprise me. I tried walking down the road a bit, hoping to find a spot with better reception, but it was useless. I had no choice but to stay the night. I found some candles in the kitchen drawer and lit a few, setting them around the room. The cabin had electricity, but I didn't trust the wiring enough to turn on the lights. The old floorboards creaked under my weight as I moved around, the sound stretching out into the silence. Outside, the wind had picked up. The trees swayed, their branches scraping against the roof. The graveyard was nothing more than a dark mass beyond the window, the headstones barely visible in the fading light. I tried to sleep. The armchair was stiff, the cushion worn thin. I shifted, trying to get comfortable, but my body wouldn't relax. I kept listening, waiting for something. I didn't know what. The wind? A branch falling? The sound of an animal moving through the grass? Then I heard it. A crunch. Not the wind. Not a branch. Footsteps. I sat up, my breath slow and careful. The sound had come from outside, near the graveyard. I told myself it was nothing. An animal. The wind shifting something in the yard. But then it came again. Slow, deliberate steps moving through the dead leaves. I reached for my bag, my fingers wrapping around the handle of the knife I always carried when I traveled. The footsteps stopped. I stayed still, my hand tight around the knife, my ears straining. Nothing moved. The wind rattled the branches, but the footsteps were gone. I didn't sleep. By morning, the world looked normal again. The graveyard was just a graveyard. The trees were just trees. The night had played tricks on me, that was all. I tried the truck again. Still nothing. I needed to find help. The town was about 3 miles down the road. Not a bad walk, but not one I wanted to make. The road was narrow, lined with trees that made it feel more like a tunnel. As I walked, I kept looking back at the cabin, at the graveyard stretching out behind it. The feeling didn't leave me, even in the daylight. I made it to town, found a mechanic, and brought him back to look at the truck. He checked everything, tried a few things, and then gave me a look I didn't like. "Nothing's wrong with it," he said. I stared at him. "It won't start." He shrugged. "I don't know what to tell you. Battery's fine. Fuel's good. Should be running." But it wasn't. He offered to tow it back to town, but I wasn't ready to leave yet. I told him I'd figure it out, and he left, shaking his head like he thought I was making a mistake. Back at the cabin, the air felt heavier. I stepped onto the porch and looked toward the graveyard. Something was off. A grave had been disturbed. The dirt was loose, uneven, like it had been dug up and put back in a hurry. The headstone was old, the name unreadable. I didn't want to look, but I forced myself to walk closer. The ground had been moved, not by an animal, not by the weather, by hands. I felt sick. My mind tried to make sense of it, tried to come up with a reason that didn't make my skin crawl. Maybe someone had been digging for something. Maybe it was nothing, but I couldn't convince myself. I didn't sleep that night either. I sat in the chair, the knife in my hand, my ears straining for the sound of footsteps. They came around midnight. Slow, closer. I gripped the knife tighter. The door rattled. Not the wind, not an animal. Something was outside. I didn't breathe. The handle turned, slow, testing. I bolted, grabbed my bag, shoved the door open, and ran. The truck started on the first try. I didn't look back. I drove until I reached town, until I was surrounded by buildings and people and the comfort of streetlights. I sold the cabin the next week. I didn't care about the money. I just wanted it gone. I never found out what happened that night. Never went back. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I can still hear it. The sound of footsteps in the dark. I never thought much about what I would do in a life or death situation. People like to imagine themselves as heroes, the ones who fight back, who make the right choices. But the truth is, when you're in it, when the danger is real, you don't know what you'll do until it happens. I learned that the hard way one winter in the middle of nowhere. It started as a simple getaway. I was between jobs, burned out from city life, and needed some space to clear my head. A buddy of mine had a small hunting cabin tucked away in the mountains. He told me I could use it for a while. Said it was nothing fancy. No running water, no electricity, just a wood stove, a cot, and a stack of firewood to last the season. It was exactly what I needed, or at least that's what I thought. The drive up took longer than expected. The roads were narrow, winding, covered in patches of ice. It was late December, and a storm had just passed through, leaving everything blanketed in white. The trees on either side of the road were heavy with snow, their branches bending under the weight. It was beautiful, but there was something eerie about it, too. Something too quiet, too still. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already setting. The place was just as my friend had described, small, weathered, barely more than a shack. But it had a roof, for walls, and enough wood to keep me warm through the night. That was all I needed. I parked my truck near the tree line, close enough to grab my things, but far enough that it wouldn't get buried in case another storm rolled in. The air was crisp, biting at my skin as I hauled my gear inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a single room with a cot against the back wall, a small table, and a wood stove in the corner. A lantern sat on the table, its glass covered in dust. There were no windows, just the door and a small vent near the roof for smoke to escape. It was basic, but it would do. I spent the first hour unpacking, stacking firewood near the stove, setting up my sleeping bag on the cot. The quiet settled in thick around me, the kind that pressed down on you, made you feel like you were the only person left in the world. That night, the wind howled through the trees, rattling against the cabin walls. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the crackling of the fire, the occasional groan of the wood as the cabin shifted with the cold. I told myself it was peaceful. I told myself this was what I came here for. But then I heard it, a sound outside. First, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, a slow, deliberate crunch of snow underfoot. I I sat up, heart hammering. I waited, listening. The wind gusted, rattling the roof, but beneath it, I could hear something else, movement. Not an animal, not the wind. Footsteps. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it at the door. Nothing. Just the old wooden planks, the iron latch holding it shut. The sound had stopped. I told myself it was my imagination, that the wind had shifted the snow, made it sound like something was moving. I forced myself to lie back down, to close my eyes. Sleep didn't come easy that night. The next morning, I stepped outside to find footprints in the snow. They weren't mine. I stood there for a long moment, staring at them. They came from the woods, circled the cabin, then stopped at the door. I checked my truck. Nothing was missing. The footprints didn't lead away, just stopped at the cabin, then vanished. Like whoever made them had stood there, waiting, watching. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe some hiker had gotten lost, passed by in the night, and moved on. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. There were no tracks leading away, no sign that anyone had left. Just those prints in the snow, like someone had come right up to my door and disappeared. I spent the day chopping more wood, checking my gear, keeping myself busy. But the feeling stayed with me, that crawling unease in the back of my mind. That night, I locked the door, checked it twice, then lay in my sleeping bag with my flashlight in one hand and a hunting knife in the other. I didn't sleep. The third night was worse. I woke up to the sound of something moving inside the cabin. Took me a second to realize what was wrong. The fire had burned low, barely casting any light. My lantern was off, but I could hear it breathing. Someone was inside with me. My blood turned to ice. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. I just listened. Slow, shallow breaths. Close. I tightened my grip on the knife, forcing myself to stay still. My heart pounded so hard I was sure whoever was in the cabin could hear it. Then the breathing stopped. A long silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement. Nothing. I flicked on my flashlight. The cabin was empty. I scrambled up, heart hammering, sweeping the light over every inch of the room. The door was still locked from the inside. No windows, no way in. But I wasn't alone. The cot creaked as I shifted my weight, and that's when I saw it. The floor near the door. Footprints. Not mine. They led from the door to my cot. Stopped right beside me. Someone had been standing over me while I slept. I grabbed my gear and bolted. I didn't think. Didn't look back. I just ran for my truck, fumbling with the keys, hands shaking so bad I almost dropped them. The engine roared to life, tires spinning in the snow as I tore down the road, not stopping, not slowing, not caring if I hit ice and slid off the mountain. I drove through the night, didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, a gas station with flickering lights and a clerk who looked half asleep. I must have looked like a madman, stumbling inside, breathless, eyes wild. I told them someone had been in my cabin, that I wasn't alone up there. They called the sheriff. He drove up the next morning, checked the place out. He found the footprints, found the door still locked from the inside, but no sign of forced entry, no sign of anyone else. Just my things, left behind in my rush to escape. And one more thing, a single handprint on the inside of the door, too high up to be mine, like someone had been standing there, pressing their palm against the wood, listening to me, waiting. The sheriff told me there were no other cabins nearby. No one reported missing. Just me alone in that cabin. Except I wasn't alone. I never went back. I don't know who or what was in there with me, but I know this. I locked that door, and somehow they still got in. I was stationed at Fort Carson in Colorado when I first heard about the hunting cabin in the San Isabel National Forest. It was one of those places passed down through whispered conversations in the barracks. An old, isolated structure deep in the woods, supposedly owned by a retired Army officer. Some of the guys used it as a retreat when they wanted to get away from the regimented life on base. I had been in the Army for almost a decade, serving as a sergeant in an infantry unit. It wasn't an easy job, but it was the only life I knew. The discipline, the structure, the unspoken brotherhood, it all made sense to me. But lately, I had been feeling burned out. The constant cycle of deployments, training, and dealing with the younger recruits was wearing me down. I needed a break. That's how I ended up in that cabin. I had borrowed the key from one of the guys, a corporal named Evans, who told me the place hadn't been used in months. Perfect for some peace and quiet, he had said. I packed light, just some food, extra clothes, my knife, and my sidearm, a standard-issue Beretta M9. I didn't expect any trouble, but years in the military had taught me to always be prepared. The drive took a few hours, and by the time I reached the turnoff, the sun was already dipping behind the tree line. The dirt road leading to the cabin was rough, barely more than a path carved through the dense forest. The trees pressed in from both sides, their branches stretching overhead like skeletal fingers. I kept my eyes on the road, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. When I finally reached the cabin, I could tell it had seen better days. It was a simple one-room structure with a pitched roof and a small porch. The wood was weathered and gray, and the windows were coated in a thin layer of dust. A rusted metal chimney stuck out of the roof at an angle. I stepped out of the truck and stretched, breathing in the crisp mountain air. The place was quiet, almost too quiet. No wind, no distant hum of insects, nothing. Just the soft crunch of gravel under my boots as I approached the door. The lock clicked open easily, and I stepped inside. The air smelled musty, like old wood and damp earth. A single cot sat in one corner, its thin mattress covered in a layer of dust. A wooden table with a couple of chairs was pushed against the far wall. There was an old cast iron stove, a pile of firewood stacked beside it. Someone had left a few cans of food on a shelf, but they were years past their expiration date. I dropped my bag on the cot and did a quick sweep of the place. The windows were intact, and the door was solid. Satisfied, I grabbed my rifle and stepped back outside to gather some firewood. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were faint, almost erased by the wind, but they were there, leading from the tree line to the cabin. My first thought was that they belonged to Evans or someone else who had used the cabin recently. But as I looked closer, I realized something was off. The prints were deep, heavier than they should have been, and they weren't made by standard issue boots. Something about them put me on edge. I scanned the tree line, my pulse quickening. The forest was thick, the shadows deepening as the last of the sunlight faded. I told myself it was nothing, probably just a hunter passing through. But the unease stayed with me as I carried the firewood inside. That night, I couldn't sleep. The silence pressed in on me, the darkness stretching endlessly beyond the thin walls of the cabin. I kept my Beretta close, listening to every creak, every shift of the wind. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off. I woke to the sound of something moving outside. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but my instincts flared to life. I reached for my gun, my heart hammering in my chest. The noise came again, a slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps on gravel. I slid out of the cot, moving silently toward the window. The moon had risen, casting a pale glow over the clearing. First, I saw nothing, just the trees, the road, the empty porch. But then, near the edge of the woods, I saw it, just a shadow, a shape that didn't belong. Someone was out there. I stayed still, barely breathing, watching. The figure moved, shifting slightly, then disappeared into the trees. I waited, my grip tightening on the gun, but the footsteps faded. Whoever it was, they were gone. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the dark, back against the wall, eyes on the door. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the sun was up, I went outside. The footprints were back. This time, they led from the porch back into the woods. Whoever had been watching me had been close. Too close. I knew I had two choices: pack up and leave or find out who was out there. I chose the second. Years in the Army had conditioned me to push forward, to face threats head-on. I wasn't about to let some backwoods creep intimidate me. I grabbed my rifle, checked my gear, and started tracking. The footprints led deeper into the forest, winding between the trees. The ground was uneven, covered in damp leaves and exposed roots. I moved carefully, scanning my surroundings, my senses sharp. After about half a mile, I found it. A second cabin. It was smaller than mine, barely more than a shack, half hidden behind a thicket of pines. The door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. I approached slowly, gun raised. The air smelled wrong, like rot and old blood. Inside, the place was a mess. A single cot was shoved against the wall, the mattress stained dark. Empty food cans littered the floor, and in the center of the room, a pile of clothing. Military clothing. I stepped closer, my stomach twisting. The patches had been cut off, but I recognized the fabric, the stitching. These had belonged to a soldier. Then I saw the blood. It was dried, smeared across the floor and walls. And in the corner, half buried under a tarp, a body. The face was unrecognizable, but the dog tags were still around the neck. Evans. A noise behind me. I spun, but it was too late. A blur of movement, the glint of a blade. Pain exploded in my side, hot and sharp. I hit the ground hard, my vision swimming. The man above me was wild-eyed, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. He was wearing an army jacket, but it wasn't his. I fought, adrenaline surging, my hands scrabbling for my gun. The second shot was enough. The man staggered, his knife clattering to the floor. I pushed him off, gasping for breath, my side burning. I didn't look at him as I stumbled out of the cabin, my hands slick with blood. By the time I reached my truck, the world was spinning. I barely made it onto the road before the pain swallowed me whole. The next thing I knew, I was in a hospital. The police found the body in the cabin. Evans had been missing for weeks, but no one had thought to look out here. His killer was an ex-soldier, dishonorably discharged, living off the grid. He had stolen uniforms, hunting down former comrades. I never went back to that cabin. Somewhere in those woods, the memories still linger. The footprints, the silence, the cold weight of a knife against my ribs, and the knowledge that I had been just one step away from ending up like Evans.